Now, I love talking about George Edwards, but I did all this work over 40 years ago now, and my memory isn't quite what it was. So, I recently wrote a chapter in a book about the Ascot martyrs in Oxfordshire, and an Anglican clergyman wrote to me to say I'd got a fact wrong, and he was entirely right, and I must apologise in advance if I do get certain facts wrong, because I kind of do other things in historical terms now. Now, cast your mind back to the summer of 1983. It was Britain was just about to embark on a general election campaign. I was assistant curator then of what was then called the Norfolk Rural Life Museum, near a place called East Dereham in the centre of Norfolk. And it was at a fairly early stage of its development, and my colleagues and I decided it would be a very good idea to do an exhibition on farm workers. And George Edwards was there as a kind of local secular saint. We could hang this on. There was a certain amount of opposition to doing this. Remember, dear old Michael Foot was leader of the Labour Party then, and the general election campaign would result in a Conservative landslide. So it was slightly against the grain of the wood. But we did, and we proceeded with this, what we called the George Edwards celebration. It coincided with the 40th anniversary of his death, and we were able to do a lot of research, a lot of oral history of activists that had known him, and that resulted in an academic conference, an exhibition, and also a partnership with a community theatre called Mask Theatre, produced this highly popular musical about George Edwards, his life and times, and that turned into a best-selling cassette, if you remember those things. And the best number from the show, I hasten to add, I had nothing really to do with this, but the best number in the show briefly became a minor hit on Radio Norfolk. So it certainly made a bit of an impact. I also got to know George Edwards' family. His son Noel became a dear friend, now no longer with us, and it made a great impact on my life. And I don't think I would have gone in the direction of my career with working class history and so forth if it wasn't for George Edwards. So I feel enormously grateful for discovering him and trying to tell the world a bit more about this extraordinarily remarkable man. Ooh, where we go? Next slide. Now, if you want a very hard childhood, George Edwards would be a prime example. He was born in 1850. His parents were very interesting. And over the last few years, I've got quite interested in his father, who was called Thomas Edwards. The left-hand image shows Edwards's birthplace, George's birthplace. It's a tiny village called Marsham, which is in Norfolk. His parents are extremely poor. His mother was a God-fearing and remarkable woman in her own right, already a Methodist. She was that last generation of handloom weavers that worked at home, literally scraping a living. She also had 6 children. She'd been married before and was widowed. She had 3 children from the first marriage, and then married for the second time Thomas Edwards. Thomas had an interesting career path himself. Again, he was a Methodist. He was a radical man. He stood up for working people. He was involved in wage claims in association with other groups of local farm workers. This is in a period where a trade union didn't exist. These were ad hoc negotiations with local farmers from groups of farm workers. And bearing in mind, particularly in Norfolk, there could be several hundred workers on large farms. So it was almost like a sort of factory situation. Thomas had a hard time from that. He found it difficult to get work. There was an oversupply of labour. Farmers could pick and choose who they employed. They didn't want troublemakers. Thomas found he had no living. This is in the 1820s, before George was born. He joined the army. He served in the army for 10 years. Came home, still couldn't find work because he had this reputation, and he continued that with opposition to the new poor law, which was being introduced by the Whig government in the early 1830s. So he had this reputation both as a wage negotiator and also an anti-poor law campaigner. He again couldn't find work, so he joined this army that was being raised by a radical MP for intervention in a civil war in Spain in 1835 to 1837, and a British legion was formed, mainly of ex-soldiers, to go out to Spain, and they were promised pensions from the Spanish government when they returned. Thomas we have no account of what fighting he saw. Generally, that legion had a hard time, but he did make it back to Britain. But the pension he was promised failed to materialize. So again, he found himself in a difficult employment situation. It was at that time he married Mary, and they really struggled. The only work that Thomas could find was as a bullock feeder, where he worked 7 days a week, and poor Mary, as I said, was trying to keep up with the new machines, doing her handloom weaving. They had 3 more children. George was the youngest. born in 1850, as I said. And his childhood was incredibly hard. They had virtually no money. He wrote this wonderful autobiography called From Crow's Scaring to Westminster, and I urge you to get hold of it. That will really tell you what poverty was like. The children were put to bed early on a Saturday so that their only clothes could be washed and ready for chapel service on the Sunday. The family had virtually no money, no food, and Thomas stole some turnips on his way home from a field one night. He was arrested by a policeman and immediately put into jail. He was in prison for a month, and the family had to go into the workhouse and were split up. And little George, age 5, was taken away from his mother. When they came out of the workhouse, Thomas went back to this bullock feeding, and little George, along with the other children, had to start work. And at age 5, he was scaring crows. He had no education. He could not read and write at this stage. I don't know. Can you see the image on the right? It shows George, age 17, with his mother. The profiles of the participants are obscure in my view of it, but can anybody see that? Yeah, you got it. He became a very skilled farm worker. He was a ploughman, or a teamsman, as they call them in Norfolk, was well regarded at his job. He had he was a commonplace Norfolk lad. He didn't differ very much. He liked japes. He did a bit of poaching. He visited the pub and so forth, despite his mother's pleas not to go. And there's not a lot to distinguish him from other illiterate Norfolk farm workers at that point. But he had this dramatic conversion to Primitive Methodism. Let me read you a passage from Crow's Scaring to Westminster, his autobiography. It was, however, a turning point in my life, greatly to the delight of my mother, for I had begun to adopt rather bad habits. I had taken to snaring hares and catching rabbits and selling them for pocket money. I also began to visit the public houses, though I never got drunk. This caused my saintly mother some anxious moments. On leaving this employer, I attended a little Primitive Methodist chapel one Sunday evening, when a very earnest lay preacher by name Samuel Harrison was preaching. He took for his text, "How shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation?" His sermon was a thoroughly orthodox one, and it certainly did appeal to me, and I was led to see that I had not been pursuing the right course. I at once embraced the simple faith of Christ as the great saviour of man, although in a rather different light than to what I do now. But I continued to maintain my faith. I still love my church, and I remain a loyal supporter of that great section of the Methodist Church, namely the Primitive Methodists, which has has done during the last 100 years so much for the uplifting of the toiling masses of England and brought faith and light and comfort into thousands of homes. So he embraced Primitive Methodism. He met his future wife at chapel, a woman called Charlotte Cork, and married her in 1872. He wished to become a lay preacher, but he could not read and write. And the stories are that Charlotte eventually taught him to read and write, but when he first went into the pulpit, he had to memorize great chunks. And this is how he proceeded. And another story is that when he first went into the pulpit, he found he had his book upside down, but still managed. And it was a it's very difficult, isn't it, with our emphasis on education, to realize how important it was for these people to embrace literacy and become educated. And again, this forms a big chapter in Crow-Scaring to Westminster. So he was active in the chapel, and he was active in a new movement that was sweeping England in particular. And this was the foundation of the National Agricultural Labourers Union by a man called Joseph Arch. This is the man on the left-hand side, a Warwickshire hedge cutter he trained as an agricultural worker, but had specialised in contracting hedge cutting and so forth. So he had a little more money. He had his own house, and he was also an activist in the Liberal Party, and the Liberals were keen on mobilising rural workers to take it away from Conservative domination. And effectively, as we'll see time and time again, the Liberals bankrolled this union. The union was very successful. They adopted the camp meetings of the Methodists. Hymn singing was part of their way of going on, and they had these enormous open air meetings. Not a very good photo. I should have apologized at the beginning for the quality of some of these images, but they are, I collected them over 40 years ago. But this is in Ham Hill in Somerset. But these great meetings happened all over the country. The union itself became a great crusade, and it recruited nearly 100,000 members, which at that point was the biggest union in Britain, because there were slightly more coal miners, but their structure was federal. It was based on regions. So it was the largest single union. And moreover, it was very successful in raising wages. Arch had some was a canny negotiator. He encouraged local strikes where he thought they could be won, and he also promoted migration as a key policy of the union, either to areas of Britain where farm workers were paid more. Generally, that's adjacent to industrial areas. So places like Lancashire, farm workers were paid a lot more than they were in Norfolk or Shropshire, for example. And for the first couple of years, it was generally successful. This is the membership emblem on the left here of the National Agricultural Labourers Union, and it celebrated the history, the recent history of the union. In the centre, you can see a vignette of Arch at the first meeting of the union, which was in Wellesbourne in Warwickshire, and the union made up its own anthem to this when Arch spoke beneath the Wellesbourne tree. Arch, though, was a bit of an egoist. He was very clever publicity seeker. He also made many enemies for various reasons, generally by his slightly overbearing personality. So I'll come on to that in a minute, because there were the union structure found itself at the centre of a number of splits. He also faced a farmers' counterattack, a very deliberate counterattack, which centred on evictions. Farm workers generally lived in tied houses, and farmers and landowners would have no compunction about evicting families who dared to join a union. And this is something that George Edwards found throughout his career, where workers who had the mere temerity to want to join a union faced all sorts of difficulties, threats, violence, and eviction, not only to themselves, but to the whole of their families. It took a lot of courage for farm workers to join and be active in a union. This particular image is from Wiltshire. It shows a highly respectable Methodist farm worker and his family, and their possessions have been thrown by the roadside. And it includes an engraving of John Wesley, and you can just see on the table there a collecting box for I think Wesleyan missionary work. Now, Norfolk was at the centre of this oppositional unions to Joseph Arch's union. In Norfolk, they have a saying, "Norfolk do different," and this is a classic case here. The man in the middle with the big beard in this photo was called George Ricks. He was at the centre of a Norfolk Federal Union, which wanted to move away slightly from Arch's centralism, and he formed quite a successful local federal union in Norfolk. George Edwards was both active in this and Edwards Union at various times. We're not sure of the time scale of all these things. There's very little evidence of these various Norfolk unions that Edwards was involved in, the main evidence is through local newspapers, because they didn't leave any archives or and so on. And this is a place called Swanton Morley in mid-Norfolk, where the sand pit there was a natural amphitheatre and was a key geographical centre for Norfolk trade unionism. This the National Agricultural Labourers Union was also met as not only by a wave of evictions, but by the way which agriculture was moving. After a very successful period, the arrival of essentially North American grain imports flooding into the country on a large scale, and bearing in mind the prevailing political culture of this late Victorian period was free trade. That was the great watchword of the Liberals, and it meant that British agriculture, particularly in grain growing areas like Norfolk with its large farms, was rather undermined by cheap American and Canadian wheat. It also became affected by imports of lamb from Australia and New Zealand in refrigerated ships and so forth, slightly later. But it meant that generally agriculture went through a very hard time, which meant that agricultural trade unionism suffered as well. Although it lasted into the 1890s, eventually the National Agricultural Labourers Union went entirely under. Edwards, nothing daunted, put a lot of effort into establishing new locally based Norfolk unions, and he set up two in the 1890s and around 1900. One based in Norwich and the successor one in Cromer, and to an extent they were successful. They trained up another generation of younger activists and so forth, and Edwards became quite a major figure in these circles in Norfolk. He was, of course, like his father, a marked man, and he lost lots of farm working jobs because of these activities. So he was variously employed from the 1890s. He had a trade of brick making that he'd learned when he was young. It's incredibly hard work, making bricks by hand, but he could always fall back on that. He was a small man. He was about 5 foot. He was prematurely stooped and so forth, and he had a very hard physical life, which brickmaking didn't really improve. He was also employed in various areas connected with Methodism, connected with liberalism. He became a temperance lecturer. Working class audiences preferred, he had in his entries in pamphlets and so on. And he also joined the Land Restoration League, which was one of these now forgotten groups that sent out these vans to proselytize all over England. They were called red vans, and again they were financed by the Liberal Party. the franchise had changed in the late Victorian period. Some farm workers got the vote in 1867, many more in 1884, and so farm workers in this late Victorian generation could now were now entitled to vote. So the Liberal Party were keen to get their votes, and the Conservative Party were. So that working class votes were up for grabs. The key reform, though, in terms of politics, was the introduction of the secret ballot, which came in 1872, which in theory meant that you shouldn't, one's vote wasn't known. Just have a look at my notes. Yeah, the other thing to remember is that George was very active in local government. The county councils were formed in 1888. George became he became a district councillor and then a county councillor. He was also a poor law guardian, and this extension of local democracy in the late Victorian period was accompanied by allowances which enabled working class people to become active, and they extended the skills of public speaking, managing meetings, and so forth, which they met originally in the Primitive Methodist chapels. That extended to local government, and not only George, many women were involved in this. Charlotte Edwards became a poor law guardian herself and was involved in local government in a major way. So, so with all this patchwork of employment, George sort of could just about struggle without having a regular farm worker's job. Now, 1906, George was already middle-aged. He was 56. The key political event in 1906 was the Liberal landslide in the general election that year. It was virtually a clean sweep for the Liberal Party in East Anglia, and a key element in that was George Edwards and his circle of farm workers. The Conservatives didn't like it. They sacked several hundred people who were known to be farm workers who were liberal activists. They evicted from their houses and so forth. With that confidence, there was a move to refound the union. Edwards was approached to do that. He founded a union called the Eastern Counties Agricultural Labourers and Smallholders Union at the Angel Inn in North Walsham in North Norfolk in 1906. And his job as a general secretary was immediately bankrolled by the Liberal Party. He bought a bike, he learned to ride a bike, and he cycled 2,000 miles in the first year, setting up branches all over Norfolk. This is on the right is Swanton Morley sandpit again. Edwards addressing the meeting with the Bible under his arm. the union was successful. It wasn't the enormous growth that you saw with Joseph Archer's union. It was a gradual growth. This amazing hat, it's on the cover of my latest book. It was worn by a man called Herbert Coldham, who was one of Edwards's activists. And there's some evidence that they were meeting in secret before the union was formally formed at North Walsham. It was generally only active in Norfolk and neighbouring counties, but it grew enough to change its name to the National Agricultural Labourers and Rural Workers Union. It did that in 1910. It also moved into its first offices, which are at Wensum House, which is just outside Fakenham. And it became a slow growth, but then it met a wave of Edwardian union unrest. It spread outside East Anglia. There's a major strike in Lancashire in 1913, in Shropshire in 1914. George suffered a breakdown. Charlotte, his wife, died, and he decided to retire. He was still, as we shall see, he was still involved in the union in various ways. The key element in the growth of the union was the outbreak of the First World War, strangely. 200,000 farm workers enlisted. There were very good reasons why they enlisted. I interviewed that last generation of, not all of them, of course, but I interviewed several dozen Farmworkers Union activists who have also been involved in the First World War. And there were very good reasons why people joined. Simple patriotism was part of it, but actually farm workers were much better off in the army. They ate 3 times a day with allowances that were paid to their families. They earned more, and they didn't have to work as hard as they did on the farms. And it created a massive opportunities for agricultural trade unionism. The younger men went, and there was an enormous demand for labour, and the older men who were still there could demand more money, and generally they were very successful at it. And agriculture went through a very prosperous time. Farmers complained, but they had to pay. Now, George, despite being a Methodist, supported the war effort. He spoke at recruiting meetings, although he actually opposed conscription, but he agreed to serve on the Norfolk Military Tribunal, which judged cases of objections to service. Some of his conscience, through conscience, some were through not wanting to give up small businesses and so forth. But bearing in mind, farm workers' trade unions were regarded as anathema by most farmers and employers. For unions to be represented at every level on these new state institutions, like the military tribunals, and the image on the right is of the Norfolk Agricultural Committee, and not only George but other union activists were part of this new debate. George was also active in recruiting women workers into agriculture, and he also took a key role in the formation of these agricultural labour corps throughout the country, who were basically farm workers who were deployed strategically in uniform where they were needed. And there continued to be union members during this time. These were older men who they found that lots of farm workers were simply not fit enough because they worked too hard to be frontline soldiers. The key, another key event was during the or series of events in the autumn of 1917, when the German U-boat campaign was extremely successful, and Britain was left with 3 weeks' supply of food. Something drastic needed to happen. Lloyd George's coalition government introduced a Corn Production Act, which guaranteed prices for farmers, and it guaranteed minimum wages for farm workers through agricultural wages boards. And the unions, including Edwards, were very active in setting these state wages. They continued with some gaps, the agricultural wages boards, until 2012. I think they were one of the abolition acts of the Conservative Lib Dem coalition. The new wages board gave a green light to agricultural trade unionism. There were several 100,000 members. There were meetings all over the place. This is at Mulbarton, just outside Norwich, and a sense that something was really happening. You can see a red flag on the image on the left. Lots of soldiers in uniform at these meetings. They weren't meant to be union members, but of course they all were, and active on leave in the union. The war ended. The first election was at the end of December 1918. George stood unsuccessfully for the Labour Party. He'd still been a Liberal the year before, but things had changed. He did not succeed. Many soldiers weren't on the electoral roll, and although Labour did reasonably well overall, it wasn't a great success in Norfolk. It was 2 years later, though, when George was elected in a by-election for South Norfolk. The union also changed its name to the National Union of Agricultural Workers. Meetings all over the place. George appeared in, he didn't have a coat to, a smart coat to appear in the House of Commons. So his Conservative opponent lent him a coat for his swearing in as an MP. Agriculture, though, generally was okay for the first 2 years after the war. Then there was a Great Depression again. Coincided, this is from the summer of 21, it coincided with a general economic downturn. Lloyd George repealed the Corn Production Act and the Wages Board, known as the Great Betrayal in agricultural circles, and that immediately gave a problem to the union, a fall in wages, fall in union membership. There was various cuts in wages, and it came to a head in the spring of 23 when Norfolk farm workers went on a mass strike against another wage reduction. It wasn't just in Norfolk, other parts of East Anglia and in Shropshire that there were major farm workers strikes. This is a group on a march to Wicklewood Workhouse to claim outdoor relief. The funny hat you saw earlier, the red one, was worn by the man with the stick, who's Herbert Coldham. And this is the banner, which is now in the People's History Museum in Manchester, a wonderful bit of Art Nouveau. The strike took about 6 weeks. It turned violent. Many of the young farm workers had seen appalling things in the trenches, and they were literally going to struggle and fight to maintain their living. There were what they call wild gangs of pickets, consisting mainly of ex-servicemen. They were supported by ex-service organisations. They were also supported by policemen. I apologise in particular for the poor quality of the image. In the front, there are two policemen who would escort the pickets to where there might be blacklegs working in a field, and then they would turn their backs, the policemen, allowing the farm workers to nip over the hedge and unyoke the horses and so forth. I interviewed a number of men that were involved in these activities. This is an unknown strike meeting, and it's thought that the union, it might have been Edwards himself, introduced the first flying pickets with these cycle scouts who went all over Norfolk. George was active in the strike, but he also tried to quell that riot. This is a famous incident at the courthouse at Great Walsingham. Some of the strikers who were sentenced, and they were wearing their First World War medals in court, ex-servicemen all, and he introduced a very clever tactic of a flying picket of magistrates. He was a magistrate, and sympathetic magistrates would be motored to where farm workers were likely to face severe sentences from unsympathetic magistrates, and that they could join the bench, and it was highly successful. The strike, though, ended. It ended with a union victory. It was negotiated by Ramsay MacDonald, the leader of the Labour Party, and they held the line at 23 shillings a week, which was the standard that was maintained. Wages were never reduced below that. Now, George was really, by this point, the grand old man of the rural labour movement. He was an MP again in 2023. He was the president of the union. He was awarded OBE in 1919, and he was the first ever farm worker to be knighted in 1929 for services to agricultural workers. It also his because he was well respected on all sides of the agricultural industry. He was also his service in the war and so forth was also remembered. This is George in his garden in Faken in North Norfolk, where he lived. On the left is his adopted son, Noel. He was the son of his niece by marriage, and he adopted this little boy. He was active in local government until his death. He had a heart attack at a Poor Law Guardians meeting and died 3 days later. His funeral in Fakenham was immense. People lined the streets, and his grave became a site of pilgrimage, of commemorative meetings. This is and the site of an annual meeting around about May Day. This is Clement Attlee, Labour Prime Minister in 1949, making time from setting up the National Health Service to go and speak in Norfolk. Such was his widespread reputation. It is all worth saying that Norfolk became a major, in political terms, it became a major Labour centre. 7 out of 8 MPs in Norfolk in the 1945 Labour landslide were Labour and sponsored by the National Union of Agricultural Workers. So to an extent, Attlee was speaking to his heartlands, just as as if he was going to the Durham Miners Gala or whatever. Oh, I'll end there with a bit of literature. Do read Crows Going to Westminster. The book on the left, Poor Labouring Men, by Alan Hawkins, is the best book, best modern book on Edwards. Alan was a dear friend and colleague of mine. He died in 2015. But his book is well worth reading. There's a bit on Edwards, but more on farm workers generally. In my book, English Farm Workers and Local Patriotism, it covers other parts of England as well, Shropshire, Herefordshire, Cambridgeshire, and so forth. And then if you're interested, on the right-hand side, there's my latest book with Herbert Coldham's Funny Hat, which came out last year. All 3 are still in print, I think, so rush to your local bookshop. Okay, that's it.